for having me here this morning, and thanks everybody who's showing up on time. Um, so I just want to let you know that I'm going to go through my little spiel, but I want you guys to ask questions after. So be jotting down things that come up to your mind when I'm talking about transition planning. I've tried to make it specific to autism, but a lot of the information is kind of goes across the board. But I think it's going to be some very useful information. There might be some little pieces of information that you've never heard before. And so that's really exciting because that is what I love to do. I love giving people kind of the insider information on transition planning because I have been through the ins and outs, pretty much everything that you could possibly think of in terms of working with people with special needs, I've done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and go through this. Hold on here. Okay, so transition planning beyond the IEP table. The reason I talked about this way is because there's a lot of times that people kind of sit back and assume that whatever happens at the IEP table for transition planning is the only thing that's available. And that simply is not true. So I wanted to give you a little background about myself first. My name is Jennifer Hulme, and I have close to 30 years of experience in the field, guys. So when I tell you I've been around the block once or twice, I've been around the block once or twice. My degree is in special education. I have taught every age group through the years, and I worked also direct support positions. I worked as an employment specialist and a job coach. Pretty recently, I was a regional director for a statewide residential provider. And one of my favorite jobs was a support coordinator for the state of Missouri, also called targeted case management, and worked for the Department of Mental Health, contracted through the Department of Mental Health. But now I am doing my own thing, and I am based in the Kansas City area, but I work with families across the country, just so you know, just in case there's some people from outside of Missouri that are on here today. Just know that this information might be kind of specific to Missouri, but a lot of it kind of goes across the board. So how many of you have heard this term, falling off the cliff? That does not sound fun at all. And I wish people would not use the term falling off the cliff when it comes to transitioning from high school to adulthood. I just feel like it should not be a term used to describe. I mean, it scares people to death, but unfortunately it gets used way too much. And one of the reasons is because you're changing from what is known as an entitlement-based program, which is like your IEP at school, and then you're changing to an eligibility-based program. So you're not entitled to things like you were in school once you get into being an adult. So parents find themselves having to learn a whole new system with little or no information to go on. So my mission in life is to change that from falling off the cliff to soaring from the cliff. That's going to be my new motto. So soaring, it means raised, it means uplifted. So this is how the individual and their family should feel when it comes to planning for the future, because it should be an exciting time. It should be, really exciting, really fun to plan for the future. So today, guys, you are going to learn some golden nuggets of information pertaining to strategies, resources, and tools for planning for your child's transition into adulthood that are specific to ASD. And hopefully the goal is for you to leave with a boost of confidence in your piece of the process and also learn to collaborate with different teams and agencies. Excuse me. But before we talk about beyond the IEP table, I just want to throw out there, and we won't sit on this for very long, but what does IDEA law say about transition? So what does the IEP have to have? Starting by age 16, if not before, some states are age 14, the IEP has to have information about transition planning. They have to have a transition plan in there. It must be individualized. It must be based on the student's strengths, preferences, and interests, and include opportunities to develop functional skills for work and community life. So, as a parent, what can you do to be more confident in the transition process? A lot of parents come to me and they say, I am clueless, and it's through no fault of their own. They don't even know where to start. So my suggestion always is to start what I like to call a transition playbook. Usually when your child enters special education, if they start from the very beginning, you have your little binder that has all the documentation for IEPs and all that. This is kind of the same thing. The transition playbook would be all the documentation, everything that you need through the transition process. And if you want more information on that, just shoot me an email. I'll give you my contact information at the end, and I can kind of go into more detail on that. Another thing that I highly recommend to all my families is to develop a person-centered plan and a circle of support. Now, you might have heard those terms before, especially if your child is in some sort of a system like Department of Mental Health or something like that. They might have a formal person-centered plan. But if you're not receiving any formal services, I still highly recommend that you get with somebody who is trained in person-centered planning and help facilitate that circle of support and come up with a plan for your child. This can be above and beyond, obviously, the IEP. This is done, at home with people that the child and the parents choose. It can be as formal or informal as possible. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide or two, I think. It's very important to maintain high expectations. And I don't think I need to even go telling you guys about this, because I think as parents, you do have high expectations for your child. I think that's great. And you need to keep having those high expectations. Attend transition fairs, community resource fairs, things like this. Just, absorb as much information as you can about the topic. Become familiar with agencies that your child might work with as a young adult. Learn about employment and post-secondary opportunities in your area. And have conversations with your child about their future, and have them often. I mean, when we all have these meetings, the child should be involved as much as possible, because it's their life that's being planned. So if it were me, I would want to be involved in the planning of my future. So try and involve them as much as possible. Okay, so I had to throw this in here. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is don't depend on 100% of what the professionals in your circle say. Now you're saying, what, Jennifer? That doesn't make sense. They're professionals. You know, of course I'm going to listen to them. And that's okay. You can listen to them, but don't take their word as the end all that be all. I'm telling you this because I've seen it 1,000 times, that a lot of times the professionals are going based on outdated information, incorrect information, or just information that they're kind of making up or they've heard from somebody else. So my biggest thing for you guys is to tell you to do your research. Ask questions. If something doesn't sound right, go with your gut. And if you're not comfortable, you know, talking to the person directly that's giving you the information, ask around. If you know people who have been through it already, get opinions from them. You can always reach out to me and just shoot me an email and say, hey, you know, this is what I was told. Does this sound right to you? Because that's one of the things that I have found, that parents tell me after the fact, is that they were told XYZ, so they went down that path, but that really wasn't the correct information. So now they're having to take time and effort to backtrack. And I hate to see you go through that. So that is kind of one of my personal things that I can, one of those golden nuggets that I can give to you. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about circles of support and person-centered planning. So as I said, this is one of the most beneficial things you can do as a parent to ensure the information transfers from your school to the future systems. And I don't think a lot of people think about that. You know, I have found a lot of times, when I was a support coordinator and maybe I got somebody on my caseload who was a young adult, I don't have any historical information at all. It just like drops. And then you have to start from scratch again. And there's been times where there's been some pretty significant information that should have been shared that wasn't, because it wasn't in the IEP. The IEP is more academic. And so that's where this person-centered planning comes in very handy. And it doesn't have to be anything, you know, majorly complex. There's very simple templates you can use, but many times a lot of that information just slips through the cracks and it doesn't get communicated from one system to the next. So parents, it's up to you to ensure that the adult system gets the full picture of who your child is and what their future goals are. Who is the biggest expert on your child? You, right? Not the teacher, not the counselor, not the case manager. Hopefully they know your child pretty well, but you are the expert. So do not be afraid to develop your own plan that has, you know, more specific details. I am 100% for that, and definitely try to talk to families about putting that into place. As I said, it goes above and beyond the IEP. It's implemented outside of the educational system. It can be made up of, like, the circle of support can be made up of family members, family friends. It can be somebody who's like a paid support, but you have to kind of be careful with that and make sure that they basically have volunteered to be there, that they're not doing it because they know they're getting a paycheck. And these people, they need to commit. They need to be committed to your child's future and seeing them through the different steps. It can be shared with the IEP team once it's developed. And let me tell you, the IEP team is not going to push you away for bringing in your own information. It only makes their job easier. So they should welcome that extra bit of data and information that they can use during their planning process as well. Okay, let's talk about timelines a little bit. So I put a little graphic here of the different timelines of like who should do what when. And this is very kind of general, but it kind of gives you an idea of what you should be looking at when. Now, don't, guys, please don't panic. Don't panic if you're looking at this and you see that, oh my gosh, I haven't done this yet. And, this, and my child's 16 and I haven't even, this is not meant to overwhelm you. This is just a guide. So do not get stressed out. I also have a free resource and I left a link. I think there's probably going to be a way to get this PowerPoint to you guys, but there's a link there that you can download a transition timelines checklist that is also very helpful. Okay, so why plan early and why should you reach out to community agencies ahead of time? So I'm going to tell you that transition from special education services and its entitlements, and remember, when I say entitlements, I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that, by law, your child was entitled to certain things. And when they turn 18 or age out of high school, they are no longer by law entitled to those certain things. So transition from one system to the next is really complicated. And for students with significant disabilities and complex needs, it's going to take time to put post-school services and supports in place. Now, this is true with ASD because there are some such unique needs that are for individuals who are on the spectrum. And so you really need to give yourself time to be able to put those supports in place. Some students will likely be using the services of many agencies, and time will be needed to figure out who can do what and who will pay for what services. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you have a child who is diagnosed with autism, but they also have a behavioral health issue. Perhaps they have ADHD, or they have, some sort of mental health issue. So you would think logic would tell you that there's maybe one department for both, but that is not the case. So you have the department in Missouri, you have the Department of Mental Health, but then it splits into two. So you have developmental disabilities, and then you also have like the behavioral health side. Now, again, you would think that those two departments communicate with each other, but that is not true as well. Sometimes they do. In some parts of the state that I've worked in Missouri, they've been really good at collaborating with each other. And then there's other parts where they do not communicate at all. So it's really, you have to navigate the two sides and see who's going to pay for what. Sometimes if they find out that you have a case manager with developmental disabilities department, they won't provide a case manager for the other side. It can get really dicey. So you want to allow yourself time to kind of sort all that out. Early and long range planning is so important in order for the student to receive many post-school programs or services. This is the case for anything from support services to for support services in college or residential services. Students and families are often faced with extreme amounts of paperwork to meet eligibility requirements, and many adult services have long waiting lists. So guys, I will tell you right now, because of COVID, even, across the country, the funding for services has been cut quite a bit. Where there weren't wait lists before, you might find that there's wait lists now. But the light at the end of the tunnel is what I can tell you from being in this field for 30 years. Everything comes full circle. Now, a few years ago, the state was throwing money at people to be able to get services. And so I would like to think that that time will come again. But just be aware that, just like everything else, when the economy kind of tanks, so does the funding for services. So be prepared for wait lists and not being able to receive those services right away. So this is just a little extra nugget that I want to throw in here. What do I do, or what do I say if the IEP team member or the counselor or the case manager says, your child just is not a good fit for employment right now, or your child isn't a good fit for living on their own right now because, fill in the blank. So what do you say? Do you take their word for it and just like, oh yeah, you're probably right? My recommendation always would be to reply with a question. So what do we need to do? What supports do we need to put into place to get my child to a place where they are employment ready? Or whatever the goal is. What is the most that we can do for my child to make it a more realistic option? That goes back to my, not hanging on every word. If you and your child, if your child has a goal and they want to work, then the team needs to gather together and find out what needs to be done to get them there. Meet them where they're at and get them to the next level. So, skills that need to be mastered for successful employment. This is really important for individuals that are diagnosed with ASD, because a lot of these things they can struggle with. So these are things that you can work on at home. Again, don't always depend on the school to be doing these things and working on it in their IEP and assume that it's getting done all the time consistently. It's great if you can supplement that by having your own things at home, staying on task. I won't go through this whole list, you can see it, but works hard without complaining. Oh my gosh, I have a 16-year-old who is not diagnosed with a disability, who I have to work on this with him day in and day out. He wouldn't like it if I was telling you guys that, but it's true. These are things that you would be working with somebody who's that age group anyway, but it's even better if you can really fine tune those skills for employment. Independent living. Now, when I say independent living, that could mean a lot of things. I like to think of it as them living in the most independent way possible. So that might mean living in a supported living environment, but receiving little to no supports during the day or something like that. So anyway, it doesn't necessarily mean, when I say independent living, doesn't necessarily mean like getting their own apartment and living by themselves. But nonetheless, these are some things that need to be mastered to be successful in independent living, no matter what the environment is. Cooking a meal, making a grocery list, knowing how to recognize an emergency. That's huge. And last but not least, things that need to be mastered to be successful for post-secondary education. These, again, are huge struggles for individuals who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And so the more you can work on these at home, because I'm sure they are working on them at school, they should have goals that reflect that. And I think we'll talk about that here in a second, but these are things that can be worked on at home too. That self-determination and self-advocacy are huge. And the earlier you can jump on that with your child, the better. So these are things that are more specific to autism. And I might be telling you guys things that you already know. So I apologize. It can be a refresher. But for the independence piece, strengthening communication is huge. So, consider an AAC device, or if they have one already, consider modifications to the existing one that's specific to, what their future goals are. Introducing visual schedules, that is huge. Using a visual schedule with your child can help transition from activity to activity with less prompting. I think we've all seen a lot of success with that. Working on self-care skills, it's a perfect age to introduce self-care activities into your child's routine, working on those activities of daily living, the ADLs, that are important life skills. Introducing them as early as possible can allow your child to master them down the road. I put a little online resource, a link there that I thought was a great resource for strategies that you can use for promoting self-care. You don't have to use that resource, but I just thought it was a much more thorough one than other ones that I've seen on the interwebs. Also, teach your child to ask for a break. Make sure your child has a way to request a break. And so if they have an AAC device, add a break button on there. There's this online resource I found. It's a break card tool that also could work in situations where they need to ask for a break, but that kind of circles back to the self-determination and the self-advocacy, having your child learn to speak up in an appropriate way when they need a break. So I want to talk a little bit about doing your own assessments. So in the IEP, when they come to making transition goals, they use the school, when I say they, the school uses specific assessments to come up with, the best future goals that they can come up with for your child. Here's the thing. It doesn't necessarily have to 100% depend on their assessments. Do your own assessment. There are plenty of assessments that you can do at home and gather your own data to bring to the table, the IEP table, when it comes time to planning these goals. It might differ from what they've come up with. There might be a huge discrepancy on something that they have found at school versus what they're able to do at home. And then the conversation needs to be, well, what's different about the environment that they can do this at home but not do this at school? So, like I said, I highly recommend you provide your own input in terms of an assessment to provide to the IEP team. Make a list of his or her strengths. This is also time to start planning for the future. So consider all the ways up to this point that you have been fostering your child's independence, and then share that with the team. A community-based skills assessment. If you Google that, there are several that are available online, and it helps you evaluate your child's current skills and abilities. And that can help with the transition planning too. Again, your IEP team should not turn any of that away. If they have a problem with you bringing stuff to the table, then that's a whole other conversation that we need to have. But 9 times out of 10, your team is going to give you a big giant hug when all this COVID stuff is done. Give you a big giant hug for being like, thank you for providing us with this data and, becoming a more collaborative team member. Safety is a huge thing. So work on identifying strangers, community members who can offer assistance, asking for help, knowing what to do if and when they get lost, doing the name, address, phone number. A lot of times, I don't think this happens so much anymore, but a lot of times an IEP goal was for the student to recite their name, address, phone number, all that stuff. And they would never meet the goal. So if that's happening with you, which I hope it's not, because that really shouldn't be a goal if they're not able to master that pretty quickly, suggest maybe just having a card and them knowing what to do with the card. Instead of putting people through the frustration of having to memorize name, address, phone number, if it's never really going to help them down the road. Using the cell phone, both call and text, identifying public versus private spaces, and navigating the neighborhood, downtown, and surrounding areas safely. I just want to go back to this really quick. So as you know, wandering is a huge concern for individuals with ASD diagnosis. And so these are things obviously that you really want to pay attention to when planning for your child's future, to make sure that they can get as many of these skills as possible and be able to use them in different surroundings. Another concern is water safety. As I'm sure you've heard, individuals with this diagnosis are very fascinated with water. And so seeking out water safety courses is a wonderful idea. And a lot of places offer them. The YMCA, I know at one time did. Locally, if you ask your contact here at Autism Society, I'm sure they have several resources for that. Transportation training is another big one. If you feel like your child is going to be doing public transportation or taking an Uber or something down the road, training them in those skills. And if it's something that they do need work on, ask the IEP team to add it as a goal if it hasn't already been addressed. That way they're getting it both at home and at school. Okay, now if your head hasn't exploded yet, I'm going to talk about funding streams just very briefly, because this part can get really complicated, but I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. So when you're talking about adult services, the main funding streams, and again, I'm going to kind of focus on Missouri. Other states, some of them are different, but if you want to know about your state, we can always, talk about that on a one-on-one basis. But funding streams, Medicaid is going to be kind of the main avenue for a lot of these services. So what a lot of families do not know is when your child turns 18, they do not, or they're not supposed to, take the parent's income into consideration anymore. It's only the child, the adult child. So there have been incidences where the Medicaid office sends something back and says, nope, family makes too much money, but you have to appeal that and say, no, my child is 18 now, it's only based on their income. So that makes them much more able to be eligible for Medicaid. And that's going to open up a whole world for them once they're eligible. They're able to get a case manager. They're able to apply for a Medicaid waiver. And that next bullet point is Medicaid home and community-based waiver. That's where you're going to be getting all those personal assistance services, rehabilitation services, employment services, residential services. Those are all paid for through the home and community-based waiver, unless you're going to pay out of pocket, which I'm assuming you don't want to do because that is really, really expensive. Okay, in Missouri, there is a little known fact. A lot of people don't know about this, so I want to tell you that there is funding called SB 40 that stands for Senate Bill 40. So if you look at your property taxes, there's a little line at the bottom that says SB 40, and it takes out a small percent. That money is set aside for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now, most counties have a SB 40 board. Here in Jackson County, the SB 40 board is through an agency called ETOS. And so they are able to give, I think it's like up to $1,000 in funding if it's requested. You do not need a case manager for this. This is something that you can request. And there are certain guidelines and stuff like that, but just know that that funding is out there for maybe a temporary service that you need, maybe some respite, maybe they're, I think on their website, they have the guidelines of what it can provide funding for, what it can't. But just know that that's out there. Vocational rehabilitation, I haven't talked too much about them yet. So they are funded through the Department of Education, which again, a lot of people do not know. But not only do they provide supports and services and funding for employment, but they also do for post-secondary education. So I've had individuals who have used vocational rehabilitation to pay for their tuition, help pay for books and different things that are needed that's based on their disability to be able to be successful in school. Okay, again, another Missouri specific funding, and this is also specific to autism, is the Missouri Autism Project. This comes from general revenue, state revenue, and is set aside, and I believe it's up to $3,000 of funding per year. I believe right now there's a wait list, but you do have to have a support coordinator, case manager, with the Department of Mental Health to be able to access this funding, because they actually have to request it through a utilization review committee. So I don't think a lot of people know about this either. It's a wonderful resource, especially if you have just a child, adult child who doesn't need a lot, but they maybe, want to be a part of a social group that has a monthly membership cost or something, that the Autism Project can help pay for that. Different parts of the state have only certain agencies that will provide the services through that funding. But here in the Kansas City area, if you're watching from this area, it's just an allocation. So you can pretty much use it for anything that has to do with supports or services for somebody with autism. So I hope that makes sense. And I hope that you utilize that if you do have a support coordinator. And again, there's the general grants and scholarships. And another little known fact about myself is I am a grant writer. I do more for individuals lately than I have for, larger agencies and providers. So I kind of know what to look for, which ones are scams, which ones are not. So, kind of be careful about those, but there are tons and tons of grants and scholarships out there specific for individuals with autism. So I talked about some of the Medicaid waiver services, so I'm not going to go through that again, but just know that there's a big list there. And I want to talk really, really quick about guardianship alternatives. When your child turns 18, they either become their own guardian, or some people use the term they become their own person. But it's either that, or parents are told that they have to apply for guardianship. They have normally been told that it's either one or the other. That's not true. There are many, many different alternatives to just full on guardianship of your child. So if you feel like your child doesn't need full oversight and they can make some of their own decisions, there's other avenues to go, and one of them is supported decision making. Now, each state is different as far as recognizing um, supported decision making. So I put a little link there where you can actually look up your specific state. But in Missouri, they do recognize and they honor that documentation. So if you want to know more about that, it's great just to Google it. It kind of gives you an overview of it. And if you need more information beyond that, feel free to reach out to me. Okay, guys, putting it all together. So I know this is a lot of information at once, and it can be somewhat overwhelming to digest. So reach out to me anytime with questions or set up a free consultation. I'm more than happy to discuss your specific situation. And I'm hoping once I get back on the screen here that you guys have questions for me, because I want to be able to take the rest of this time to help you guys. I have a transition planning insider membership where it's like a monthly membership, and you get access to a lot of our group chats, many online courses, and any of the current or future resources that I develop myself. I also do like a transition planning mentorship, which is a 4-week self-placed and one-on-one coaching. I also do just one-on-one coaching by itself, which I think is very beneficial for people. But my main advice to you all is do not sit back and assume that your child is covered through what they receive at school. Do your research, reach out to others outside of both systems to help you avoid roadblocks and setbacks. And then I have ways to contact me. The best route to go, honestly, is this link tree, because that'll be all the links to all my freebies and all my classes. And I think that's a really good resource, and it's got my email and everything on there. So now I'm going to attempt to get back to my regular screen. All right. I think I made it back. Okay, well, I still have people here, so that's good. I want to know what questions we have.